Badger fans, we're talking game theory. We're talking Phil Longo's play call mix. It's Badgers Analytics with Gardner Fickle. Let's get after it. All right, so we're talking game theory. We're talking Phil Longo's play call mix. First, what is game theory, right? Um, Game theory is really a mathematical modeling technique, right? And usually where it's most aptly applied is economics, politics, war, things where you're really trying to analyze strategic decision making, understanding your opponent's strengths, weaknesses, likelihood that they're going to do X, Y, or Z, and then really examining yourself and understanding kind of each of those things within yourself. What are your strengths? What are your weaknesses? What's the probability I'm going to do X, Y, or Z? And in the football context, right? It's play calling, right? How often do I line up in 11 personnel, 12 personnel, 10 personnel, 22 personnel, right? What formations am I constantly running out of those personnel packages? What play types am I calling within those scenarios as well? And then what's the strength, right? How much EPA am I gaining? What's my yards per attempt out of each of those different scenarios? And then, right, not just looking at yourself, but then looking at your opponent, right? The defensive coordinator on the other side, what formations are they lining up and what's their coverage tendency? What's their, blitz tendencies? And how does that kind of correlate to given those sets of play calls that they can make, what's the payoff structure against the play calls that I like to make, and really understanding deeper the probabilities of certain play calls and payoffs happening. What's the optimized play call mix that maximize my strengths and really exploits my opponent's weaknesses to the fullest possible extent. So that's what we're going to dive in to today. So first, let's just kind of break down a very simple game theory model, right? And so as I talked about in the story on Badger Notes, right, let's just, for example, we had this big play and now we're sitting in the red zone. But as the offensive play caller, my tendency is once I'm getting into that situation, there's an 80% chance that I'm going to call a straight run, right? And so in this model, right, for simplistic and for effect, right, I'm saying that the defense has three choices, right? They can heavy box, load the box up and call a run blitz. They can just load the box or have a light box, but, commit, a safety or a linebacker to the run, right? And each of these play calls for the defense has an EPA payoff, right? For that offensive play call, straight run, drop back to pass, play action RPO pass, and then at those heavy box run blitz, heavy box, or light box run blitz play calls for the defense, right? Each of those has an EPA payoff for that intersection, right? And so in point number one, right, huge tendencies equal high potential for bad outcomes, right? So given that I have an 80% likelihood to run a straight run, the most obvious play call, right, and what's maximizing the EPA payoff for the defense would be to call heavy box and run blitz every time, right? Because although, a straight drop back to pass is going to lead to a really strong outcome for the offense or a play action RPO pass, right? I've committed almost everybody to the box, and I'm thinking it's going to be a run, right? So if you don't run, it's going to be a massive payoff for the offense. But there's an 80% likelihood that I'm going to call a straight run, right? So overall, the expected payoff is going to be very, very high for the defense and very poor for the offense, right? So in scenario two, right, a better mix equals probably a more balanced approach from the defense. And now in this scenario, right, we haven't mixed our play calls enough to optimize for the offense a positive expectation of EPA, right? Because I'm still 40% straight run. So given these choices that we have in the model here for the defense, they should still call a heavy box and run blitz, because over the expectation, right, when I do call that straight run and they do call the heavy box and run blitz, it's going to be a really, really bad outcome for the offense. And so given that, right, they should still do that, right? The model is saying that the expectation for the defense is they'll generate across that play call mix and them running the heavy box and run blitz, a negative EPA payoff, right? Good for the defense, bad for the offense. And so what we can see is that utilizing your strengths from an offensive standpoint, or kind of utilizing your opponent's weakness or over aggressiveness in this case, would be, hey, we should, in this situation, right, if they're gonna, either run heavy box, run blitz, heavy box, or light box and run blitz, we should probably pass, right? And so shifting your play call mix to exploit the defense's tendencies, or kind of the box that I'm putting them in this model, is to really commit to stopping the run, right? Changing your mix to more pass heavy is going to generate a lot more positive outcomes for the offense, right? So first, huge tendencies, or very weighted to one side, right, it can cause a high potential for bad outcomes, right? Because the defense then, right, or the offense, right, if you have a really strong tendency to do one thing, right, your opponent can take advantage of understanding what's the max payoff of their strategy given that scenario, right? So a better mix is going to create a more balanced opponent approach. That's going to kind of even out, right, their ability to really generate high value outcomes for them. And then the third is utilize your strengths, right? Understand your opponent, understand yourself, understand the situation, and change your mix based on that, right? So it's a bit of a cat and mouse game of really understanding how this works. And so we'll kind of get into that here. So this is definitely a more advanced game theory model, right? So we've got offensive style and strength, and we've got defensive style and strength. And so what I mean by style, right, is really that probability distribution here of the offensive play call or the defensive play call, right? So we've got an even 25% likelihood that the offensive play caller is going to call play action run, play action pass, or straight drop back pass, or straight run, straight handoff. And then what their EPA payoff is based on the defensive play call, right? So is it a heavy box blitz? Is it a heavy box base defense? Is it a heavy box, but they're going to drop back into coverage? And then, or is it a light box in each of those three scenarios, right? And what's the EPA payoff for the offense given their, strength versus that defensive play call that they've shown over the course of the season, or whatever the time frame that you're trying to judge here. And then you've got the defensive style and strength, right? So what's their probability that they're going to load the box and blitz, or what's their probability that they're going to, lighten up the box and drop back, right? And then again, what's their EPA payoff given that play call and the offensive play call, right? So that's really the inputs to the model. And so the next is we're really going to show what that output looks like. So given kind of the even mix model, right? So that's scenario one at the top here, right? The offense is equally likely to call any of their play types. And the defense is equally likely to call any of their play calls as well. And so what we can see here is that kind of that even on even is definitely leads to kind of a strength for strength scenario. More or less, right? And so the defense is much stronger in across all of these different play types and play calls on an even basis, right? So there's definitely plays where the offense is gaining ground, and there's plays where the defense is gaining ground, but more so the defense is gaining ground in a lot of these situations, given the strength in some of these buckets, right? And if you're going to call it even or not really divvy up your play call mix at all, right, and you're just going to be even across the board, the defense is going to win out in that scenario. So let's say now the offensive coordinator is running this game theory model, right? And he's trying to say, okay, I know for a fact that the defense is going to, call it even across the board. But because they're so good, I'm going to shift back into more base concepts, right? We're going to keep it simple, straight runs, straight drop back pass. We're going to really load heavy up on that. That should limit our mistakes. And so what this model is showing is, well, you're really not understanding the opponent's strengths or your weaknesses in this sense, because doing that, or changing your play call mix from even to more heavy straight drop back to pass or straight handoffs is actually reducing your expected payoff in this model, right? You're dropping from negative 0.04 to negative 0.07 in your total mixed strategy payoff. So really, it's important to understand, hey, know your strengths, know what mix is actually going to cause a positive benefit for you, right? So you really have to examine, where are you good at? Where is your opponent good at? Where's your opponent bad at? And how do I exploit that better, right? And so that's scenario 3, where actually it's almost the exact opposite of kind of what the offensive coordinator was thinking is, right, they should be doing more play action, more heavy mesh, right? Based on, the play call mix of the defense and their strengths in those play calls against those play calls. And so you'll see that total mixed strategy payoff is actually right around 0. So a 0.04 improvement in the total payoff versus a loss of 0.03 just by changing that play call mix into a more optimized zone, right? Taking advantage of your strengths, exploiting your opponent's weaknesses, and their play call mix, right? Really understanding those things can definitely help the play caller and using game theory to do so. Right, so it's pretty advanced game theory model, right? And so the 3 things that I want you to know is mix matters, right? So an even mix, right? Kind of what I said, scenario 1, it's strength versus strength, right? And so the offense is going to lose that battle. But if you know your advantage, or if you don't know your advantage, like in scenario 2, you can get on the wrong side very quickly, right? So it's important to know your advantage. And then it's also important to exploit your advantage and your opponent's weaknesses. And that's really scenario 3, right? Shift more to the play action RPO game, get out of the base concepts. Given their mix, that's going to be the best expectation and payoff for the offense. And so really just kind of wanted to highlight that for you in that advanced game theory. So hopefully by now you've got a pretty good understanding of game theory and the application to football. So kind of shifting now into Longo play call mix, right? Because you didn't come here for a lecture on game theory and its application necessarily to football. You really want to understand it in the context of Wisconsin football and Phil Longo, right? So this is kind of some charts that I'm kind of teasing with you here. We're not going to get too much into it, but really what I've done is tracked, right? How does Longo's play call mix trend over the different field positions that he may be in, and how that changes from half to half, right? And so if you can kind of think, right, we're kind of building up the complexity of the game theory model, right? And so if you think adding in formations, personnel packages, the half, the field position, where, like, are we up, are we down, right? Adding all of those things into the model, how does that change the tendency of the offensive defensive play caller? How does that does your team play better once it gets the lead? Does it play worse when it doesn't, or when you're down, right? How do you, as a play caller, understand all of these complex dynamics, and how can you use game theory and that modeling to help inform your decision making, right? Hey, if I'm up and my offensive linemen are feeling good, and right, we see in those situations that we have really high payoff or high EPA expectation when we're calling runs in that situation. Hey, do we want to shift our play call mix to a little heavier dose of run? But is the defense going to know that, right? And so it's definitely a cat and mouse game in the corresponding posts in this series, right? I'm thinking right now it'll be 3 parts, right? This is really just the introduction. We'll get into more of those complex dynamics. How do you change your expectations or your understanding of the situation, given, hey, what are you doing? What am I doing? And what is my opponent doing to try to counteract that? Right. So that's really the field of Bayesian analysis and statistics, right? How do I take in new information? How do I change my probabilistic expectations given this new piece of information and apply that to what play calls am I calling? So lastly, right, just kind of at a high level, right, what does this look like, right? If we think about, right, the advanced game theory model, what is Phil Longo's kind of probability or tendencies across the entire 2023 season, right? Well, he was pretty heavy in either straight drop back to pass, right, 38%. For the total play call volume. And we also ran a heavy dose of play action RPO runs, right? So heavy mesh where what I denoted as essentially play action RPO runs, right? So there was a heavy mesh action or elongated mesh, and Mordecai decided to hand the ball off in that situation, or Braden Locke in that situation, right? So really trying to understand the percentage of that probability. In part two, we'll talk about what did the EPA payoffs look like in the situation for Longo, and then how do we start to develop these models with more real world data, right? Not the fake kind of simulated data that I kind of had in the few examples here before. So hoping that that shed some really good light for game theory, improved your understanding around that, and teased a little bit for Longo, and how can we start to use these game theory models in real world data of what he's actually been doing in those payoffs to really understand, is he optimized? Is he not optimized? Is there room for improvement for Phil Longo, or is there not? And so really that's kind of what part two and part three of this play call game theory series is going to be about. So appreciate you watching this video. Like, subscribe, comment. Really helps, obviously, kind of grow the channel. So would appreciate that. Gardner Fickle signing off. Hope everybody had a great 4th of July. And I know if you're like me, you can't wait for the season to get started. So we'll have analytics content for you, Badger Notes, and here all the way up and through the season. And hopefully it's a good one for us this year.